Wonderful. So yeah, I think this could be a really useful conversation for folks, not only at academic museums, but just across the board in terms of creating groups like this, because it seems like such a necessity in the world now. But I kind of wanted to see what the impetus was for each of you. So I guess my first question is just, how did your group begin? And I'll start with you, Jennifer.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. So our group started basically on some very informal conversations. As colleagues, there are a few of us who have gravitated to this work over the years, and our conversations led us to feeling like we needed more of a space. We needed a container for some of these conversations, and mostly around sort of racial equity, challenging images in our collections, programming, and so and exhibitions. There have been some concerns raised by different members of staff over some of our some exhibitions, and we wanted a space to really have a dialogue around these. So we created a sort of core group of people who, again, just through dialogue, have been rallying around these topics of diversity, equity, inclusion. And it included members from education, public programming, operations, curatorial, and installations. And then basically we took this core group of people, and over sort of a 6 to 8 month period, we developed some protocols and practices and conversations that we then expanded out. So we're in a sort of second phase of our group right now, but the origin was a sort of very friendly, organic kind of one.
Great. And what about you, Molleen? How did your group begin?
The Yale University Art Gallery is going through a strategic planning process right now. And in December of last year, our director, Stephanie Wiles, asked me to form a task force focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to help advise the strategic planning group on some steps forward, which would likely include some workshops for staff. One of the first steps was that 5 of us participated in the Undoing Racism 2-day workshop that's run by the People's Institute, and we did that in January of this year. And then following, I formed a group of colleagues from across the museum, being mindful to invite staff from different areas of the museum and with different backgrounds, and also being mindful not to assume that people who have been historically underrepresented would definitely want to do this. The group is comprised of staff in curatorial, in education as I am, facilities, security, publications, and visitor services. In our very first meeting, we talked through definitions of the words diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility to try to find a shared vocabulary. We agreed on some community guidelines about listening and respect, and we each responded to the following questions by writing on Post-it notes. What issues related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility matter most to you? And what the Yale Art Gallery, a more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and accessible place? There have certainly been conversations earlier at the gallery about DEI issues, both small and informal, and organized. About 2 years ago, women started meeting to discuss the gallery's exhibition history and the role of women in history. We know that we impart value on works of art by displaying them, by talking about them, by writing about them. And we called for a more diverse and inclusive exhibition program. So some of what was we were talking about in that meeting or in that gathering, we are now talking about in our task force. And also in my work as curator of public programs, I really see it as my responsibility to make space for multiple voices, and certainly the historically underrepresented, to encourage dialogue and ultimately to help bring about cross-cultural, cross-community connections and understanding, whether that happens in the museum or beyond its walls when we are open. So I feel like there's been like lots of different conversations that were happening that people were interested in participating in, and we've now, it's kind of, those efforts are being put toward this task force.
Great. Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more, perhaps a little bit later, about the difference between sort of bottom up and top down decisions in terms of creating these groups. I think that could be really interesting. And what about you, Andrea?
So at the Peabody Museum, our DEI team began as a grassroots effort with 3 people. Eric Riddell is our registrar. She was our NAGPRA coordinator. Nicole Palfi-Mahori is our director of student programs. They came to my office one day and said, we know you've been doing this work for a while, let's work on it together. I work primarily with New Haven high school students, and so we have 100 youth in the museum who don't always feel like they're represented, so it's been a big part of the work that I do. We started informally with shared interest in improving our own cultural competency when working with historically marginalized communities. For example, one of us wanted to know about cultural etiquette with visiting tribal leaders, and we've realized we didn't know everything that we felt like we needed to know to do our jobs well. So in these coffee break conversations, we came to realize that we saw broader institutional barriers that we didn't have tools in place to address. Because we and our peers work with cultural artifacts and natural history objects, we felt we needed some shared practices for communication around these objects that we just didn't have. We have this strong youth program and knew that teens were having some complicated experiences in a predominantly white institution. And all these questions emerged at the same time that the museum was forming a series of action groups on various other topics like revenue generation and sustainability. So we asked that DEAI be added as one of those action groups, and we got approval to formalize our committee.
Great. So yeah, it sounds like they were all slightly different in first coming together. But I'd also like to know, what did you learn sort of moving forward? Were there any things that were unexpected that came up in the process? Do you want to start, Jennifer?
Sure. Yeah. So I think our biggest learning curve right now has been going from our small sort of trusted circle to including everyone in the institution. So we send a meeting to all staff that anyone is invited to participate. And so that sort of transition has brought up some important lessons for us. I really think that starting from that small group and creating a basic operating structure was really important. I didn't realize how important it was going to be to have a co-created mission statement, community values, guiding principles, and just sort of a North Star that helps guide us as we expand. And now we have Zoom community values because, of course, these online platforms sort of require their own etiquette. We operate through a co-learning model. So we have co-facilitation where every member of the group is expected to facilitate a conversation on a topic that matters to them. And we also have a note taker. We really value transparency. So we want everyone in the museum to know what we're talking about. We take notes, but we create process notes out of that so that any sort of confidential or personal sort of information is scrubbed out of those. And so we're constantly, even looking back at previous notes in preparation from this was a bit of a learning experience of how far we've come. I think also one thing we've learned is how important trust is and building trust in the group. And one exercise that we've recently taken on before COVID was to honor each other's beginnings. And that was really sharing personal stories about who we are and how we came to be. And that really honoring that intersectional identity and learning and being people first and people centered has been really, really powerful. And I'm just excited. I also want to just emphasize this is a group effort. I know there are members of the DEI YCBA team on the call. And I also want to just acknowledge with humility that there are people on the call who've probably been doing this work for much, much longer. And I want to make sure that that we have space for their voices as well.
Great, and I'm going to move over to you, Molleen. So just moving forward in the process, what kinds of things came up for you? What did you learn?
Since the closure, our task force has met about every other week, and we actually just met this morning. We're working toward a document with a DEIA vision and goals, values, and actions, some suggested first steps and possible resources. And one of the ideas that we've struggled with as a group, and as Jennifer says, I am one person in a larger group. And if any of the other members of the task force are on, I hope they'll chime in. One of the things I think that we're still trying to work through is what's the relationship between the DEIA work that we're doing for the strategic plan, specifically for this task force, and our group going forward. Are we a support group? Are we an advisory group or something else? Maybe when this strategic plan is over, do we move, this is the next phase, possibly 2 groups? I think that time will help figure that out. I hear what you're saying, Jennifer, about kind of the importance of starting the way you want to begin. And I think that it makes a lot of sense the way you all started. One aspect that we have talked about relative to the group, that going forward, a support group should be open to anyone who's interested, and an advisory group ideally would be limited and would have rotating appointments. So I think we'll be grappling with that as we go forward, but really we're at the very, very beginning of this work, and I have a lot to learn.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the sort of role of the group changes based on what its goals are. Are you creating guidelines? Are you advising? Are you doing these different things? So I find that a little bit interesting. This isn't just a social group per se. Like, it's really tied to what everyone can get out of it in different ways. Mm-hmm. And so what about you, Andrea?
So a first step where we learned quite a bit was in hosting a series of listening sessions. We invited all staff to attend. We had 40 or 50 people come to various sessions, and we asked staff to write on Post-it notes, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? What are some things we do well? And what are challenges or problems that you have observed? That last question allowed staff to anonymously share some of their personal experiences and traumas that had been invisible to other staff. And seeing those explicit incidents and feelings in writing on a wall was rather powerful and eye-opening to staff who hadn't had those experiences or exist in more privileged spaces. So that gave us this shared experience that we could all reflect on and move forward from there. As we started to look for resources, it was also eye-opening to learn that the university didn't necessarily offer some of what we needed as public-facing institutions. There are really well-equipped offices in HR to support affinity groups and prevent discrimination and support staff of the university, but we lacked resources for training in cultural competence or community engagement for public serving institutions. Museums just have a different set of complicated issues that the rest of the university might not deal with on a daily basis. And we also learned that everyone in our institution who's engaged in these conversations with us comes with their own perspective and very different ideas on the work that needs to be done. And that our senior administrators, although they have very different perspectives, have all been really in full support of us figuring out collectively what the next step should be.
Yeah, and I think, it's really interesting having these museums in an academic structure, because I feel like, each group sort of needs to find a place in that academic structure, and it might be very different depending on whether you're coming from, from the museum side or from HR or from elsewhere, sort of where that should fit. So that also kind of defines that group in a different way. So I guess this fits really nicely into my next question, which is, where did you find support? So I'll start with you again, Jennifer.
Sure. I think our primary source of support is really each other. I think I've had incredible support from my supervisor and from our division. I've found incredible support in the core group that started this, and now our expanded members. We are meeting once a week over Zoom, but we're also texting and calling and following up and checking in. And I think that we've created a level of trust that we really are seeking in our workplace with one another. We have found support also in I would say our director has been very supportive, and senior leadership of the museum have also been supportive. And I don't think this work would be possible without their support. And there are some Yale-wide DEI leaders who have offered that extra boost when we really needed it. And then just like an example of how we build this trust, or we put this sort of people-centered vision is one example of a recent meeting where we really wanted to connect as people and check in. And so the only agenda item was to kind of reflect and write down on things that during this time, something that felt like a high, something that felt like a low, something that helped, and something that hurt, and writing those sort of in quadrants and sharing them out. And that's just one way that we try to create that sense of community despite our physical distance.
Oh, that sounds really wonderful. I mean, it's, you know, that the idea that the experiences are part of your diverse nature, and that really needs to be given the proper attention. I think that's really great. So did you, where did you find support, Molleen?
Similarly, I have found support and inspiration in all of my colleagues who are committed to this work. These can be really hard conversations to have, and it takes trust and honesty and a willingness to be vulnerable and open-minded. It can be really hard to be self-critical or be critical of your institution, and some, of course, have concerns about retribution or consequences for speaking out. I have found like support and inspiration from the connections it's allowed me to have with colleagues. Some of my colleagues have, shared how stories of their past or how they came to be here, or hurdles that they've had to overcome, and those bonds have been like bolstering. As part of the strategic planning process, I have felt support from my institution and the director to embark on this work. I've also found support in colleagues across the museum or across the institution. Like Jennifer has been incredibly supportive and generous in conversations and sharing resources. And it's great now to be connected to Andrea too. So thank you. I have been really grateful for the generosity of colleagues across Yale. There's work being done here, particularly at some of the professional schools, and that really inspires me, like the drama school, forestry and environmental studies, the nursing school. They're doing incredible work, and in many instances have deans of diversity on staff. So, and they've been really generous in sharing how they've approached their work. I have, even though it is, as Andrea says, it's a different situation, I have found the affinity houses really helpful. In particular, there's a Native American Cultural Center, and I have a close relationship with many of the people who work there, and that's been, they've provided a ton of support and guidance to me. Colleagues across museums in the cultural sector have been super helpful. There is so much, there's a lot online, like there's a lot of strategic plans focused on diversity that one can find online to help kind of give guidance as to how to begin this work or how to frame it. And really, like in my personal life as well, my children's school is doing a lot of work on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on forming affinity groups. And I have found support in those meetings. So really looking for it in lots of different places.
Yeah, I'd actually like to ask you about some of those resources a little bit later too.
Sure.
Because what I'd like to do is, you know, once we have a recording of this conversation, I'd also like to include resources for others that are looking at creating a group or expanding their group. So any of those links that you could send me, I would love to have those to put those up. Right, so Andrea, where do you find support?
I echo what my colleagues say about finding support in other members of the group. I think our relationships have really grown over the past year and a half that we've done this work. I feel like I have a different relationship with the members of this group than I do with anyone else that I work with. Our conversations and the level of emotion involved has just taken our professional and personal relationships to a different place. We also realized that staff across the institution were more ready to have these conversations than we anticipated. And so after having listening sessions and some other conversations, we found ourselves having a lot of hallway chats with colleagues and coworkers who had questions that they previously weren't sure how to ask or hadn't really considered. So that's been really helpful to just have random hallway interactions that solidify that this is important to the entire institution. And we also had a colleague who was doing some DEI consulting who is in the midst of a tour of multiple museums. He was able to come on board and help us create some structure and to formalize our plans. So those are some resources that have really helped us push things forward. And of course, our senior staff in telling us definitively, yes, this is something that needs to happen. This is a part of our mission and our goals. Go do it.
That's great. Yeah, someone coming from a place like Penn State, you know, I realize these big universities, sometimes it's really hard to find those pockets of people that are doing the same things, and they could pop up anywhere. So it's really wonderful that you created sort of a network where you can find that kind of support. So a lot of the folks that are listening today either already have these groups or are trying to create them. So I was just wondering, what kind of advice would you give someone who's trying to create a group like this, especially say in an academic museum environment? Jennifer?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've laid out a few of our practices for actually running meetings. I think that finding that meeting time is going to be really essential. But beyond sort of the mechanics of the group, finding, as Molleen mentioned, you know, like a similar community of practice in your community is really, really important. As Molleen's school, my children go to a public Montessori school that has an anti-bias, anti-racism group, and I've been going to that for about 3 to 4 years now, and it really helps to have other outlets and other perspectives. So that I definitely think is a plus. I think in the meetings and in the work, being really patient and meeting people where they are. Everyone is going to have a different reason for showing up, and various levels of familiarity with issues around race, gender, class, etc. So just doing some of that foundational work is important. Right now, we are focusing inwards on ourselves as staff, and trying to make sure that our house is clean before we welcome guests in. And I think one of my pieces of advice actually came from Crystal Feemster at one of the programs Molleen organized, which was, she said that she teaches to the most vulnerable person in the classroom. So when she teaches, she's thinking about that student who's feeling really uncomfortable or really vulnerable because something that they're talking about around issues of race or gender or violence is having a real impact on them. And I think that our group is trying to center the voice and the experience of the most vulnerable, the most historically excluded, the person who's the most on the margins in our institution on staff. And then hopefully that will sort of spiral out to the larger, our audiences. And then finally, I think, and this came up yesterday in one of our anti-bias, anti-racism meetings, was that DEI and even ABAR itself can be commodified, and that these terms can just be an easy way of sort of putting a Band-Aid on a much larger institutional problem. So recognizing that redecoration does not mean transformation, that the work is ongoing and long-term, and it's hard and challenging, and that we seek comfort and solace in one another. I think that to me is been one of my guiding lights through this work.
Wow, that's really true. I mean, it's kind of funny because this is the whole point of the group in some way is, you know, recognizing some very deep-seated things, but it's also something that you know, to some degree would have to sell to others in the university, possibly other, you know, leadership and that sort of thing. So in a way, you know, someone might find it attractive, not for the right reasons. But I think, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting issue that'll come up. And I think because we've been seeing a lot of sort of commodification in the world of issues that shouldn't necessarily be commodified. So that's a really interesting point you brought up. So Molleen, what advice do you have?
I agree with everything Jennifer said, and I love that she brought up Crystal Feimster. She did this really incredible program, and we've quoted that so many times, I think, because people were so moved by it, and also it kind of gave us direction, like who is our audience? If we can think of our audience as the most vulnerable person in the room, or the most vulnerable that we can imagine, I think we can shift some of the work we do in really meaningful ways. Again, we're at the very beginning of our work, so I don't really feel like I'm in the position to be giving a lot of advice. For me, beginning our task force by finding a shared vocabulary and gathering some data has been important. I feel like we need a shared vocabulary in order to move forward. I have found reaching out to people really helpful. Every institution is unique, and it'll require an individualized approach, but there's a lot of good work that's already out there, and people who've been doing it for far longer. It's been, so talking to Jennifer, for example, or deans of diversity at schools across campus, there are courses related to diversity through the Dean of Diversity and also the LGBTQ Center. That's a great first step. And this is not instead of doing my own work, but those kinds of conversations have helped me. I think being really transparent and documenting the work that you're doing is important. Participation in our group is optional. And I think I said this earlier and others have said it, but it is for some, it's an extra burden when they're already experiencing injustices and exclusions. And there's a lot of emotional labor there. For others, this is an opportunity to have their voices heard, and they've been energized by it. So those things are very personal. I have found that some consistency has helped our meetings. So beginning with the community agreements, for example, like always having this reminder for the kind of community we want to foster. And I would say to be patient, because this work takes a lot of time. This is not the kind of work that you can rush through.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea.
Our advice is do it. If you're having the thought that things aren't quite what they need to be, then others are thinking the same thing. So just do it, start having the conversations. Create space for others to be heard, especially those who don't feel like they have the power to share their experiences or to question the things around them. Make that space available for those questions to happen. Listen to those who may not want to speak yet. Make a really tangible plan, but also recognize that some of the seeds you plant today may not fruit for years. So as Molleen was saying, it's hard, but we have to be patient and recognize that I might just take a step today that will have an impact 3 or 4 years from now, which is difficult to be that patient. Don't push the work onto people who are already overly burdened by injustice, or assume that because someone is a member of a marginalized group that they want to be responsible for this work, but also amplify the voices of those who do wish to speak and find a platform to lift others up above yourself to do this work.
Great. Yeah, that sounds like wonderful advice. So while we were talking, a few things that I wanted to include as resources came up. So I just wanted to see, if there are any specific resources that you can name that we'd also be able to share with everyone else. So what resources can you offer to others that have one of these groups or is trying to start another one of these groups?
Sure. So Molleen mentioned the Undoing Racism workshops, and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond has a great website. These are going to be mostly web-based things. Co-creating effective and inclusive organizations is a local organization that also I think of as one of the top ones, at least in New Haven, but they have a great website, as well as racial equity tools and, of course, museums and race. LaTanya Autry has an incredible list of readings and bibliography she's compiled. And then I'll put a little plug. Molleen and I were actually thinking of at CAA of possibly doing a workshop or continuing this conversation hopefully in person in New York. But that hopefully would also potentially be a resource for anyone interested. Anyone who's interested in facilitating, joining, it's just a dream for us right now, but wanted to put it out to this group.
Yeah, and we'd love to be involved with RAAMP as well. And we have both workshops and idea exchanges. So it could really be, you could discuss any number of formats, but I think that would be great. So what are other resources? Molleen, you also mentioned some courses. Were those already mentioned by Jennifer?
I think Jennifer mentioned many of the sites I was going to mention. Maybe this isn't the same kind of resource, but as an art historian and an educator, I always look to artwork as a resource for this work. And I think that we can learn so much by looking, listening, and talking together. And I often find that we can have really difficult conversations in front of works of art that we can't have otherwise. It kind of helps ground us in our conversation. So I think that's, I guess, a piece of advice that I would give, that's someplace where you can do really important work and you can start in your own institution. There's so much good writing on these issues. And I think Jennifer mentioned LaTanya's list of books and writing. So I think that we just got a new great bookstore in New Haven. That's a great place to people get ready. It's a great place to shop for some of these, well, not right now, but to eventually go and shop for some of these. But like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. My child went to a high school diversity conference and came back with Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Joy DeGruy and was really inspired by it. So that's on my list of things to read. I liked, or I was interested in a group of 3 essays that Aruna D'Souza wrote on whitewalling, art, race, and protest in 3 acts. And there's lots of music and film that I think can kind of ground us in this work. The American Alliance of Museums has done a lot of work related to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in museums. They both have a book and a pretty robust website. And there's, as I was mentioning before, there's a lot of strategic plans for diversity available on the internet. So like the Cleveland Museum of Art, for example, that's out there and available for anyone to look at. And it really gives you a sense of, or can guide you in framing these issues and how to move forward.
That's great. And actually, anyone that's listening right now, feel free to email me other resources that you think of as well. And I'm going to try and compile all of these so that we have a place where we can all go to look at these things and to find other things that we may want to look into. And I really love the idea of our work itself being a resource, because we've been having a lot of discussions about the importance of the humanities, especially right now, and sort of the fact that there are a lot of funding cuts that are going through the humanities. And one of the things about the humanities is that it teaches empathy and it teaches understanding. And that's a really powerful tool, being an art historian and having the ability to have students focus on objects, on images, and to be able to kind of get them to go to a different place in their mind, and to also make them a little bit more elastic and more flexible socially. So I really love that you added that as a resource. So Andrea, can you think of any other resources? I know we already have a pretty exhaustive list.
Those are so many great ones.
Yeah.
I think I would add museumaction.org is just a list of great resources. And these others are more in the science museum world, but CCLI, the Cultural Competence Learning Institutes, and also iPage out of Science Museum of Minnesota are doing some really great longer term projects. And then for less academic resources, I just encourage people to connect to people that you don't usually talk to and who live in different worlds than you do, and make social connections on a non-academic level.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because I think a lot of us also are kind of in our own little groups that we haven't created artificially, but it's just that's our comfort zone, and that our comfort zone ends up being other people a lot of times. So yeah, that's a really good point. So there was something else that came up in a previous conversation that we had, and that was, do you consider this professional development?
Yep. Thank you. So my answer is just yes. Like, I think this is absolutely professional development, and I think it should be treated and respected as such.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a lot of this is really training for yourself and others, and finding new ways of making that space what it should be just for the community. So yeah, I like the idea that that this should be thought of as professional development just as much as, learning new skills in terms of technology. These are social skills that are really necessary in this time and age, as well as others. Great. And there was another question about funding. So getting into the nitty gritty, have you considered or found any funding opportunities for this at all?
So we have not actively sought out funding opportunities for this, no.
We have not yet either, but again, we're at the beginning of it, and I think that's possible in our future. I just haven't entered that yet.
We haven't found funding yet. Currently, this is work that we do sort of on our lunch break or on coffee breaks.
Sure.
We did apply for some funding for a Science Museum project on gender representation, where we would analyze gender in our social media and then take some steps to shift that representation. That's just something that we applied to.
Great. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from anyone else if they have any other ideas about funding opportunities, just to sort of share that with everyone that's interested. So we've got about 9 minutes to 3. Would you guys mind if I open up the floor for questions?
Sure.
Great. So yeah, anyone that has any questions, if you want to unmute yourself and turn on your camera, feel free to do so.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name is Leah. Thanks for doing this. I work at Drexel University. We're also starting a program. I work at the museum, but it's actually for the entire college, so that's exciting. I'm just kind of wondering if you could speak about what sort of specific goals you guys are coming up with, or what kinds of measurements of success you're using to measure yourself against. Like, what are you, for like lack of a better word, like actually doing? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what are the actions that that your plans are integrating, and what kinds of successes or failures, which is also a great teacher, are you seeing with those? Thanks. I'm gonna go back now.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. I can start. I think first, I think one of the things I've learned from the ABAR work that I've been part of is that we actually, and I think this is true of our group, the priority and the goal first is to build that foundation of trust and that community, and that can take sometimes years. Your university is not going to want to hear that, but just so that you know that for me is really one of the major priorities, and it's a really valid goal, I think. But in terms of thinking about your situation, Leah, I would say that two of the things that we're actively working about and or like in the dreaming phases of is, one, we're working on museum-wide community values, and translating some of the practices that we have into what would these practices look like if applied to the museum as a whole. So we're writing and co-writing and drafting and redrafting these community values that will then be in a draft form for the rest of the staff to respond to. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I've always kind of dreamed about is having a DEI audit of programs, exhibitions, collection acquisitions, just things that, having a seat at the table, and even an audit of our website. What kind of language are we using? Is it fully accessible? These are actionable things that are are in the pipeline.
This is Molleen. We are right now working on a document that has a vision for what we would propose as the gallery's vision, the Yale Art Gallery's vision, as it relates to DEIA issues. And then taking those Post-it notes that we did at the very beginning, and once moved online, we did like anonymous Google forms, because we wanted people to be able to write and feel and have some confidentiality. We took all of that data and then we organized it into categories. And so now we have the beginnings of a vision statement, categories like collections and exhibitions, education and programs, New Haven, accessibility, and we have a goal for each of those categories. And we are compiling like workshops that we would, people who work on this, consultants who work on this, but also workshops that we think we would like to recommend that people in the gallery take. That's kind of like the work that we're doing right now. I think that will change when we're done with this document, and also when we get some feedback from the strategic planning group. I have found, I know I mentioned the Cleveland Museum of Art strategic already, but I think that would be a great one to look at if you're at the beginning of this. They receive funding and it's described there, but it also, like, they have, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is like, we need accountability. How can we build in accountability? How can we measure our success or failure? I think doing an assessment at the beginning and an assessment at some point later is really important. At the same time, I think that, numbers don't tell the story. Like, you need like qualitative responses and assessments. So I think that those are all things that we'll be thinking about, but we're not quite there yet. Colby also has a great plan for diversity, and I think it's online.
So we started with listening sessions. We synthesized a lot of that data. We are about to implement a survey with all of our staff that was in consultation with our consulting friend. Once we get data from the all staff survey, we plan to do some community focus groups. We really want to gain a better understanding of how we're viewed in the local community. Once we get that data, we'll put together a mission statement and a set of goals that will cover a sort of 1-year plan to a 5-year plan.
Great. Is there anyone that has any other questions? Feel free to just turn on your camera and turn on your mic and say something.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vera Rose Smith. I'm at the Stanley Museum of Art at the University of Iowa. And my question concerns contingency and continuity in these programs. I am about to transition out of this institution, and I've been the person that has been in charge of our diversity and inclusion initiatives when it comes to accessibility and disability. And there is not a person that will be taking this on, and I had always been on a temporary contract. So I'm not sure how other institutions handle this, or what your thoughts are on contingency and continuity in planning.
Yeah, I would say that's something that we've been up against, because my colleagues realized that whenever DEI came up, people would say, oh, Andrea does that. And I didn't want to be the person who did that. And if I weren't doing it, then no one else would. So that's one of the reasons we felt like we needed to get at least a team of 3 or 4 people together who would take on that work. So I think that relationship building of getting a small devoted team helps. So if one person does go away, the rest of the team can keep moving forward.
Yeah. Hi, Vero. I want to give you like a virtual hug. Good to see you. I think I totally agree with Andrea. I think that we had a few bumps in the beginning of forming our group, and having multiple leaders in play at all times made it actually possible for us to kind of make it to the next step. So, you know, having that core group from the beginning was essential for our group to flourish in this moment. Yeah, unfortunately, it sounds like it's a little bit too late if you're already transitioning out, but that would be my advice.
It can't be something that lives in one department. It has to be work that's embedded in the philosophy of all the departments across the institution, ultimately to be sustainable.
I would agree. And it also can't be something that lives with one person, because that's too much for one person. And also, I think you're much more effective if it's a team. That's a heavy weight for a single person to bear. And but it does, as Jennifer says, it sounds like this advice is perhaps coming a little bit too late. So I hope, I don't know, somehow we figure it out.
Are there any other questions out there? We also had someone that was able to get into the chat that was saying hello. Oh, it's Lisa Borgstor, says, hi, Molleen, it's Lisa Herbert. So it's great to see
Hi, Lisa.
Hear about your work. And thanks to everyone, really great insight, advice, and resources. It's very sweet. So yeah, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to turn on your camera and turn on your mic and chime in. And
I would imagine we're all happy to chat with you offline. we've grown from having conversations with people in other institutions. So always happy to chat through ideas with you.
Great. Would you like me to include your email addresses with this recording?
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'll let you see it once we have the recording all ready and uploaded. And I'll add some resources, and I'll see if anyone else has any other resources. And if anyone does have anything to add, feel free to email me. You should have my email, but just in case, it's cbuckley@collegeart.org. My name is Cali. I'm the head of RAAMP, which is Resources for Academic Art Museum Professionals, which is a part of CAA. So unless there are any other questions, I think I might let everyone go now that it's 3:03. Wait a few more seconds just in case anyone else has any more. One last sip of coffee. Well, wonderful. If I get any other questions, I can forward them to you and we can talk a little bit more. So yeah, it was lovely to see everyone. Thank you so much for taking your time out to talk about this. I think it's a really important topic, and I think this recording is going to be seen by quite a few more people. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.